Oh, there we go. See, that's how easy it is. You just click go online. We're like, hey, everybody, welcome to Hangouts with James Fee. This is James Fee. I've got Peter Batty this week, who's my special guest. Hi, Peter. How you doing?
Hi, James. Good to see you.
Yeah. So, Peter's been on before. This is your second time. You're the, I think you lead all Peters in attendance now. You're the Peter of note.
Oh, very good. Yeah, it was 2.5 years ago. I was actually looking at that last night to try
Has
and,
it really been that long? It doesn't seem like it, but I guess it is.
yeah, fall 2012, I guess.
No. Hey, how quickly time flies, right? So, well, it's different now because I'm not at WeoGeo, and I don't have Madeline to help. This is only me. I've got a bunch of interns. I've got the James Fee with Hangout interns who, actually, I don't have any interns. I always like how they, whenever they're listening to a radio show, they always talk about interns actually doing something.
Yeah.
But I don't have interns. Oh,
No.
well. So, I thought we could talk. Peter was actually at Phosphor G 2 weeks ago, I guess, right? 2 weeks ago? 3 weeks ago?
Yeah, I guess it was 2 weeks. Yeah, just over 2 weeks ago.
Yeah, and he's been to many of them, and if you guys don't remember, Peter was actually the chair of Phosphor G when it was in Denver 3 years ago, 4 years ago.
Yeah, 2011 it was.
Yeah, so 4 years ago. That was the full-blown Phosphor G, not an NA one, right?
It was.
Yeah. So so I guess let's just jump into it. So what did you think about I mean, you've been to many of these, so what did you think about the conference?
Yeah, it was really great. This was the North American version. Overall there was just a huge amount of energy and excitement, which is generally something I find at both Phosphor G and State of the Map conferences. More so than the traditional GIS conferences I go to, though there's not so many of those left now. But and I never get to go to the Esri show, not being an Esri user. So. But yeah, overall there was a lot of interesting stuff there. Mapbox were very prominent. They had 10 presenters, I think, and they're doing a lot of different interesting things that we could talk about. So I don't know if you just want to dive in.
Yeah. So let's start. Let's just start with like what was the theme? I mean, obviously, like internet is around, so people don't like talk about, hey, let's put our maps on the internet. What exactly do you think the theme was of this Phosphor G?
Well, it's probably hard to pick out a single theme. I mean, there was, obviously there was a fair mix of the traditional kind of OSGeo products, the PostGISs, the GeoServers, open layers, and so on. But say that there was definitely more of the kind of Mapbox and new web mapping. So overall, I guess the area that the biggest single theme was probably web mapping in various different regards. Quite a lot on vector web mapping, which is one of the hot new areas, I guess. Quite a bit on drones, which has been a general theme at conferences recently.
Yeah.
So those are probably some of the big themes, and then one other kind of non-technical theme that several people commented on, myself included, was actually there were a lot more women than previous conferences. I think 30% of speakers were women or something like that. So traditionally the industry has been so kind of white male dominated. It actually it felt quite different. So that was really good. It was good progress.
Yeah. So let's get into vector mapping, because I know that's a subject that you think about a lot, and I think about a lot. I actually was talking to somebody about it and explaining what it was, and they said, well, that's not vector mapping, that's just raster mapping. So, what do you think about this whole push to have vector tiles? Do you think it's going to be useful, or do you think it's such an edge case that most people don't really care?
Well, yeah, so I do think it's interesting, actually, and I've been thinking quite a bit more about it since the conference, and in fact since I wrote a long blog post, which I guess I should plug at some point, but that's on my GeoThought blog, and we'll talk about some of the things there. But actually, since I wrote that blog post, I've been thinking about the whole vector tiles thing quite a bit more. But I guess just to kind of summarize what's happening there for anyone who's not too familiar with it, Mapbox in particular has been pushing an effort to do vector tiles, so they're kind of like an alternative, for everybody. If you're familiar with how web mapping has worked for quite a while, then a core part of that has been displaying raster tiles that you can slide around on a slippy map and you zoom in and you get new tiles. And I've always actually been a big fan of raster tiles and still am. They're very fast, they're very cross-platform. You can render stuff from all different systems on the back end and have them look exactly like they did in the other system. So they're very kind of universal.
Yeah.
But the idea with vector tiles is you can do a few things that you can't do with raster tiles. So, and I guess I should also say that there's multiple uses of vector tiles. One is you can use them on the server side, which Mapbox is doing, in order to create raster tiles so the client still sees raster tiles. But in that case, you can more dynamically style things. So if you suddenly want to change your roads to a different color, you can very easily do that, which you can't easily do with raster tiles if you've just got baked in raster tiles. But then you can also draw on the client side as well. So you can download the actual vectors to the client and draw them there. And again, you get more flexibility on styling, but you get some kind of cool new things too. So like the ability to rotate things. Rotate maps very smoothly, the ability to continuously zoom in, whereas with the raster maps you sort of zoom in a factor of 2 in steps, whereas it's this much more continuous zoom. You can rotate labels, which is kind of a cool thing. So as you rotate the map, your labels always stay right side up. And then perhaps the final big thing is they're really quite nice for offline applications too. It's like if you download raster tiles, so they do have a number of advantages, but if you download enough raster tiles to use offline, then it really takes up a lot of space if you go down to a pretty deep zoom level, whereas with vector tiles you can go down to a much not such a deep level and you can still draw good quality maps from those, so they are good for offline. So that those are a bunch of the drivers for them. So that's a little bit of background, and a few interesting things at the conference were, it's been very much Mapbox driving those, but quite a lot more people are getting involved in that now. So MapZen was doing some interesting things. MapZen has stood up an OpenStreetMap vector tile server now that you can use in your applications.
Mm-hmm.
Spatial Dev has written a plugin to Leaflet to allow you to display the vector tiles using HTML5. And kind of a curious thing we get more into as well is that Mapbox hasn't done as much integration with Leaflet as I would have thought they would, because Vladimir, who's the main developer of Leaflet, works at Mapbox, and that's part of Mapbox.js.
Well, let's talk about that a little bit, because that's the big thing. I mean, as a community, everyone loves Leaflet, and we try and use Leaflet as much as possible. And then there's other larger ones. I mean, the Esri JavaScript API, Mapbox has one. Pretty much everybody has their own JavaScript API. But so vector tiles are these really popular. Everyone wants them. They're excited about them. But in reality, Leaflet does not support them.
Yeah, so that is interesting, and I kind of commented on that on my blog afterwards. That reflecting on it, Mapbox is doing all kinds of really cool things, and they have lots of really bright people, and generally lots of excitement there. But it did strike me as odd that they're not doing more. I think Leaflet is a huge asset that they have, and they have and the community has. It's very widely used, and to me, it would just really help adoption of the new technology if it fitted in better to that. And I did ask about that a couple of times, and the answer I got, which I overall wasn't that satisfied with, was that they're just technically hugely different things. That with Mapbox GL, they're trying to enable this kind of rotation, and Leaflet doesn't support rotation today, and it's continuous zoom and things like that. But overall, from a higher level, as an application developer who uses Leaflet, I still think you could plug those things in, and indeed, like I said, other people have written plugins. So I hope they will do more. And actually, I had a brief interchange with Vladimir on Twitter afterwards, and he kind of said, well, we're focusing on the core work now, and we'll do interoperability later, which is, to some degree okay, but I think if you don't start it fairly soon, then people start looking at other options, or have to do their own thing, and I think you can't leave it too late.
Yeah.
So
Well,
it'll be interesting to see how that all shakes out.
so I'm curious about this. So, I mean, the amount of time that people spend talking about vector tiles, to me, exceeds the actual use of vector tiles. Now, we know Google uses them, Mapbox uses them, but do you see people actually really using them beyond these large enterprisey type applications? I mean, beyond just someone creating a simple web map, are they like, well, let's go ahead and create vector tiles? I mean, personally, I don't see it, but you're at Phosphor-G, so.
Yeah, it's still quite early days. I'm not sure there's that much usage in the wild, as it were, yet. I mean, the stuff that we're working on, we actually make a lot of use of raster tiles because we're working with old legacy complex GIS products, and that have their own obscure symbology and annotation and everything. And a nice thing is we can generate tiles from them into raster and have the maps look the same, which is what the users want to do. So it's a little bit hard for us to immediately transition to vector maps without losing the look of the maps that they want. So, I think we are quite interested in it for offline use. Like I mentioned, we're doing quite a lot of offline stuff, so that's what would drive us. But I think it's quite early days still. I think one other thing on this whole vector tiles thing is it kind of struck me partway through. They were talking about the format. And it's interesting. So the format is this very kind of, it's like a binary, pretty complex format, and it's really focused on compact data storage and whatnot. So it's a sort of complete opposite of GeoJSON. And I'm a big fan of GeoJSON. I mean, it's super simple and readable and everything. And obviously they have different aims, but it really struck me that it looks very, very similar to this format that I used to use back in the 1980s. I'm so old that I was doing GIS back then and worked for IBM, and they had a format called the interface format file, and it did things like basically storing coordinates as offsets from the previous coordinate, because then you get smaller numbers, so you don't have to store as many digits, and things like having dictionaries for attribute values, so when you encounter an attribute value, you don't repeat it every time, you save an integer. And so these same kind of techniques are in the vector tile format, and they all kind of make sense, but it was just kind of ironic to me, or interesting to me, how cyclical these things are. And then I got to thinking about it a bit more. I mean, I mentioned that in my blog post, but since I did that, the other kind of interesting thing that strikes me about tiles is when I started doing geo mapping applications back in the 1980s, it was all about vector tiles then. They were actually, it looked remarkably like the vector tiles in a way, in that the early 1980s systems were really CAD products, as in computer-aided design. And you'd have a set of tiles because you couldn't handle more than that one map sheet in memory, and you would have these attributes in this quite compact format inside each tile. And that actually had a lot of limitations, which we'll get to momentarily, but over the course of the 80s, or when I started in the mid-80s, the big quest was to get rid of tiles and get to continuous vector maps. And there were kind of a couple of steps in that. One was removing the attributes from the tiles into a proper database, but still the graphics were in tiles. And then the big push was really trying to migrate from the tile format to a continuous database, where you had just vectors that you didn't have to split, and you could just pull out what you needed more dynamically using spatial indexing. So it's kind of interesting how things go in these cycles, because we're really back to the beginning of that cycle. And some of the reasons why people wanted to get away from tiles back then were things like, it can be good for rendering, and in the case of web tiles, it's a really convenient way of fitting in with the existing way people do web mapping and easily figuring out what you pull down to the client. But like for interaction, if you want to mouse over a line or a polygon, it can be split across a whole bunch of tiles, and so you have to start stitching those together again, or it looks really weird to the user. And so that's kind of really a pain. And then certain things like labeling are kind of hard to do in a tile context in some cases. If you're just labeling points, it's fine, but if you're labeling lines or areas, and all of those things are chopped up, that's kind of difficult. You get into editing as well. It's like as soon as you start wanting to edit those vectors, you have to sort of join them all together, edit them, and then split them across all the tiles again. So those were a lot of reasons why tiles went away the first go round. And so the more I think about it, while there's a lot of cool things in certain respects and people are excited about it, I do think that vector tiles are going to be kind of a transient thing, and really the end game is that you want to have non-tiled vectors, and I think rasters will continue to stick around too. So so that's maybe the contentious thing that I would say is I think that vector tiles are not the future of web mapping. I think vectors have a good role to play, but vector tiles I think will be something that.
Yeah, I mean that's the question, right? Because right now to produce these vector tiles as they currently stand, it's hard to. There's not a lot of tools that do it. Mapbox has their tool set. There's ways to do it using command line tools, a couple open source projects. But I think Esri has one I've heard that's coming out that's supposedly similar to Mapbox's spec.
Yeah, and that was actually an interesting bit of news that came out, that supposedly Esri said during the Dev Summit that they are going to use the Mapbox tile format, which would be cool if they did, because Esri has a bit of a history of
going out of their own way. If you
they have their own JSON format instead of GeoJSON, for example.
Yeah.
So that would be great if they did that. Although the subsequent posts I saw said Esri wanted to contribute changes to the spec, so that made me slightly nervous as to whether. I hope that's all just, hey, it's tweaks to the spec, but it will be interesting if they get more involved, whether it sticks together as one spec. But that would certainly, obviously if Mapbox adopted it, several other open source people have adopted it, and Esri adopts it, then that would really make it a de facto standard pretty quickly. But I say the question is, to me, while there are a bunch of cool things about it, I think pretty quickly people will find limitations about tiles, and the real winner might be the people who figure out how do you do vectors without tiles. So I would maybe lay a bet, if we talk in another 2.5 years, maybe it will be sooner than that. But
so streaming vectors to the client.
I was going to say, Mario, what I was going to say is I think that raster tiles will last for longer than vector tiles, because I think there's a lot of benefits to raster tiles still, that they're and a lot of GIS people sort of diss Web Mercator. I never really regarded myself as a geography person or a GIS person, but in many ways I think that Web Mercator and raster tiles are the single best invention in my 28 years in the industry, or whatever it is now. And the key reason for that is it's just so interoperable, and I think people often underestimate that. Yeah. But I can pull my maps from old systems like Small World, from Esri, from cool new things like CartoDB, whatever cool new rendering they came up with heat maps or fancy fonts or whatever, they all look identical in that one environment. And it's this universal thing that everybody splits up the world into these same tiles and whatnot. So it's become so commonplace that I think people take it a bit for granted. But actually, I think there's huge value in that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the reasons why people are developing vector tiles make sense, right? I mean, the idea that you don't want to lock yourself into creating tiles is a pain in the rear. It takes time. The minute you do them, they're out of date. That kind of stuff. That's kind of why I like the idea of vector tiles. Is my tiles can live, they can be updated. I don't have to worry about cooking tiles for the whole world. But I'm kind of the same boat you are, where it's like that's an awesome benefit, but none of my clients really care. Their data doesn't change that often, and in that case, it's really hard to convince anybody that, as someone said in the IRC, most people only need to put points on a map.
Yeah.
I mean, that's really what we're talking about here. Is most of these maps, if they have they may have a polygon, rarely do they have a line, and we're just talking about throwing some simple little GeoJSON on a map, and Leaflet does that so well. So it's really cool that Mapbox and Esri are really looking at this, but it's the simplicity, as Steve just said of this in the IRC, don't underestimate simple. And
yeah.
Creating vector tiles today is just so hard and so difficult and so edge case that...
I don't know if it's so hard. I mean, not that I've actually done it, but just the tools that were talked about at the conference, they're definitely growing.
Well, they are, but they're still like for technologists to do this. They're not. If anybody can create raster tiles right now. There's so many tools that do that. You just right-click, say, create my tiles, pick a format, and go with it.
There is a bit of a debate as to, say that the cool things in a way are like that you can rotate it right. You get these labels, and it's very smooth and whatnot, and all of that is cool. But it's like a bit like when Microsoft brought out the 3D buildings in Virtual Earth, whenever that was, 5+ years ago, and everyone's like, "Oh, wow, that's cool," but did you really need it in an application?
No.
But in a sense, it's interesting going back to Leaflet that Leaflet doesn't rotate maps, and Vladimir is adamant, and actually there's another side branch we could go into, but Vladimir is adamant that he's not going to do rotation because he wants to keep it simple. But Leaflet has obviously been hugely successful and dominated the open source web mapping market without doing rotation. So how many apps do you really need that for? But having said that, we do have a need for rotation in the things that we're doing right now, but in a specific case, which is for mobile apps where people are walking or driving along the road and they want a head view. So I think for most desktop-based apps, you probably really don't need it, but that lack of rotation in Leaflet may push us to something else for mobile apps, which would be a shame because we really like Leaflet for lots of other things, but it doesn't look like rotation is going to come in Leaflet. It might be come out of Mapbox doing Mapbox GL and then bringing the two things together, but say that they're really kind of developing separately.
Yeah, so Brian Timoney is always has a.
Actually, I didn't log into IRC here, so I'm not seeing.
I don't know. They're sniping at you.
Are they? Oh, you have to.
I think he called you pasty middle-aged white guy. I don't think that was directed at me.
Yeah. It takes one to know one.
So let's talk a little bit about Leaflet then. So in your blog post, you talked a little about Vladimir and his thoughts on development, pressures he felt, and all that. I mean, why don't you go a little bit about what he had said, what showed you concern, but where and what you think the future is going to be.
Yeah, so Vladimir talked. I mean, he gave a great talk, as he always does. He's a very engaging speaker and obviously super bright guy doing lots of cool things. But yeah, it was interesting because he did get into talking about the fact that Leaflet 1.0 had taken a lot longer than he'd hoped, and still they're hoping to have a beta out soon, but they're still not quite there, and he didn't have an exact date. And then he got into a bit of detail about certain things that are just you would think would be simpler, but have proved quite complex, like doing flyover animations where you, kind of Google Earth style, that you go from one place to another, you kind of take off and fly over. And I would kind of debate on the whole thing of if Leaflet's supposed to be so simple, should you really be putting that in there? But anyway, it's a separate topic. But things like that have proved really difficult, and lots of different cases in different browsers, and then he talked about the fact that he had been feeling burned out in various ways, and that it's a sort of fairly well documented phenomenon of open source burnout. If you create a new product and you can just focus on developing it and doing all of this good stuff, but as you get more and more users and it becomes very successful, you start to get all of these different requests from different people who want different things. And in the open source world, you get pull requests from different people, and in a lot of cases you have to say no to them because it's just not to standard, or it doesn't agree with the way that you want to take things. And and that all is hard, obviously, saying no. People put a lot of effort in, and so you kind of go through this transition from being able to focus on the technical stuff to having all of this other stuff to deal with. So he talked very openly about that, and I had a lot of sympathy for him in that. And then not only that, but Vladimir lives in the Ukraine, of course, where there's a war going on. He had twin girls last year, so he's just had a lot going on. So he gave a good talk. But I said in my blog post I was a little bit concerned, but both for him and for Leaflet, that hopefully he can find a way, and Mapbox and the community can find a way to get more people involved. And I've actually myself gone through that a couple of times in my career, not with open source things, but two quite successful products I've created where I was really the initial creator and designer and developer, and then they've grown and become big, and then you have to deal with support and all of these other things. And in both cases, I kind of went through that transition, and it is a hard thing to do. You have to give up a lot of control that you had before, but you know, it's necessary for your sanity too. So I kind of hope that they'll be able to figure out a way of going through that process, because it seems like, you know, Vladimir is very much the owner of Leaflet, and say it's great, Vladimir's great, but I hope that they can figure out where that goes.
And well, worst case, there's always open layers.
Yeah, and that does do rotation, so I may actually have to look at that for some of the stuff that we want.
And it's lighter than, you know, OpenLayers 3 is so much lighter than it used to be. So.
Yeah. But actually, talking of rotation, well, and vector maps. So there's probably two other things we should mention on that kind of thing, which is D3 and Cesium.
Mm-hmm.
So Cesium, I actually hadn't really been properly aware of before this conference, and for people who haven't seen it, it's like it's a JavaScript library that is kind of like Google Earth. Basically, it lets you fly around in a very dynamic way, and it does 3D and terrain and everything. And they have really super cool demos, and somehow I'd missed up to this point. I think I realised that at the last FOSS4G I'd seen a demo in passing with D3 and Cesium, but the focus had been more on D3. But anyway, Cesium, I thought one of the presentations there had the coolest demos of the whole conference. The most fun one was you could drive a monster milk truck into the Grand Canyon, and it sort of bounces around and whatnot. But a lot of interesting things like satellites flying around the Earth, and just some of these paraglider pilots flying in the Alps, and you could see their 3D trails over time. There's quite a bit of temporal stuff in it too. So overall, Cesium was like super impressive, and I've done some quick experimenting with it since, and it's very easy to bring in standard tile image layers and GeoJSON and that kind of thing. So that's going to be interesting to see how much people use that. I don't know. Have you messed with Cesium at all? Or?
No, I've looked at it from, you know, I basically when you had mentioned it and I saw your blog post, the milk truck demo.
Yeah, that's a winner. So.
It's kind of amazing to think about that kind of stuff. But you know, the only problem with it is like that's the demo as a milk truck. You know, it's almost like I want somebody to create something awesome, and then like here's somebody using it in an amazing way, not just. I'm driving a milk truck down the Grand Canyon, you know?
Well, it's true, yeah. But you know, I mean, there were various other interesting things, and I do think that's something to watch, and definitely something I'm going to dig more into. And it's especially interesting in light of the fact that Google deprecated the Google Earth API, so you know that if you want to do those kind of 3D WYSI globe applications, this is an interesting alternative. The one thing that they don't have yet that Google Earth has is 3D buildings. So they have, I think, pretty good 3D terrain models, but they did say they're working on that. They didn't.
Yeah, so it's basically a 3D globe with elevation, and everything on top of the Earth is flat, except for the milk truck.
Yeah, well, yeah. So yeah, you don't have the buildings and so on. But you can easily, you know, bring in different base map layers. You know, you can have your OpenStreetMap layers, and the standard viewer has Bing and whatnot. So you know, there's a bunch of different sources because Bing is still a thing. So
yeah, Howard Butler says NORAD Santa Tracker is Cesium, so that's cool.
Yeah.
There's a use case, the Santa Tracker.
Exactly.
Finally.
Yes, that was definitely a cool thing. And then. D3 is another thing on the vector side that a number of people are doing interesting things with, and you know that's been there wasn't a huge amount this conference compared to some others I've been to, but there were at least a couple of presentations using D3, and one of them with a lot of nice examples which I linked to in my blog. But I don't know about you. I mean, I just kind of dabble in JavaScript, not enough to be really good, but I've seen various bits of D3 code, and it always looks pretty incomprehensible, but these examples were slightly less incomprehensible than the usual ones, it seemed to be, so kind of a good thing to look at. And then I did hear word that somebody else was looking at doing some kind of drawing of tiles using D3, which would be interesting to see. And in fact, one last thing on vectors. Who knows? It will be the last thing, but there's a company called MapSense out there that I came across. I was introduced to them by a sort of investor guy, and had a chat with the sort of founder, Erez Cohen, and he gave me a demo, and I was really impressed. They did a really nice job with very high volumes of vector graphics, and they have their own back end and front end, so they're not using PostGIS or whatever. They have their own storage, and they still haven't got a public demo online, but it sounded like they were getting pretty close to that, and they were also, I'm not sure that's going to be an open source thing, but they were talking about open sourcing certain components. So anyway, MapSense is another interesting outfit to look out for on the whole vector mapping space.
Yeah, well, that's cool. Yeah, a couple of people said they liked the Cesium. And I guess if it's good enough for the NORAD Santa Tracker, I mean, I'd like to think the kids would be crying if their Santa Tracker collapsed. Sorry, Santa's not coming this year. He disappeared over the Canary Islands.
Absolutely. So I should have a little look at my list. What else haven't we talked about that's interesting? Oh, so another really cool thing was OSRM, the open source routing machine. I don't know if you've had a chance to look at that one.
No, I've only seen it from where we're on the web. I haven't really seen a demo of it yet. And this is not anything. This is not what Mapbox is doing, right?
Well, actually, so it is Mapbox now.
Oh,
yeah.
It is, okay.
So yeah, and I don't know. So the guy talking about it was Dennis Luxon, I think, but I guess he's working for Mapbox now. I'm not quite sure how long he's been there, but it does seem like obviously Mapbox has acquired a lot of the talent in the industry, doing some cool stuff. But OSRM basically is this very dynamic routing engine. So it's kind of like you see in Google Maps, where you can really just drag the route interactively, and it recalculates in a fraction of a second. But this is all open source, and it works against OpenStreetMap. And again, there's a link in my post that goes to the sort of live demo, but you can just click and route all the way across the US, and it really is in a fraction of a second, and just click to come through Denver or whatever. Yeah. So that's super. The speed of the routing is super impressive, and B, it's kind of impressive as a demo of how far OpenStreetMap has come for routing. I think that just I mean, not from scientific tests, but just testing a few different routes around where I live. It really seems like the data is really pretty good for routing now. I mean, I guess people like Telenav and whatnot are doing a lot with that. But so I think the main missing piece now is the geocoding, address matching kind of stuff from OSM.
Yeah, interesting. So and this thing works essentially how we're used to the Google Maps one, right? You can drag routes and it reroutes you. You can put waypoints in.
Exactly. You can just put the start and end points, and it's super fast to calculate that. But then you can just drag any intermediate point, and it basically just reroutes as you drag. So I definitely recommend folks to have a look at that. It's super impressive.
Well, that's neat. What's the status of that project right now? Has it been released, or is it still in development phase?
Yeah, I believe it's released. It's all open source stuff. I haven't dug into the code or anything. They did say they're working on a few new things, like drive time polygons, that kind of thing, which would be interesting. And then, not 100% sure on this, but I'm pretty sure they said that Mapbox was going to be working on some kind of traffic, live traffic stuff as well.
Oh, wow. Of course, yeah, you need some sort of server to handle that, right? I mean,
yeah, but I think that was right.
Oh, interesting. So, I mean, it seems like everything we talk about here, you mentioned Mapbox. You also mentioned they were big there. Did you feel it was overpowering, or you think it's just this cyclical thing we go through every every Phosphor G, there's some company that dominates it, and then we wait till the next company goes?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, there was certainly a strong presence there, and but they were all great presentations. They were doing lots of interesting things, so it didn't particularly bother me. I know as a conference organizer, you always kind of have to go through that when and I mentioned this in my post, but back at FOSS4G in Denver, the big question was, it was OpenGeo then, but now boundless. Are they too dominant on the agenda?
Yeah.
And so you always have to keep that as a balance. But it was 10 out of 150 presentations or whatever. So while a lot of the interesting things we've talked about, are being driven by Mapbox, there were lots of other things that aren't. Say like Cesium and D3 and so on. And then of course, in the work I'm doing, we use PostGIS and GeoServer very extensively, and they're great products and still going strong. But there's not. I guess it's more that the really new stuff. A lot of that was from Mapbox, whereas a lot of the more established products that are being used for real serious projects are, less newsworthy in a sense, but still great products.
Yeah, I mean, Paul Ramsey does another state of PostGIS talk, which everyone goes to, but
yeah, I mean, Paul does fantastic talks, but I'd seen I saw his talk in Portland 6 months ago, and actually one of the controversial scheduling decisions of the organizer was they put Paul Ramsey, Vladimir, and Frank Warmerdam all on at the same time.
Oh.
And to some degree, I can understand the rationale. It's like, well, if you put a big name on opposite people who aren't so well known, it's unfair on all the others. But and it's a no-win situation being a conference organizer, as I know. But I would have voted for giving them all a bit shorter time and putting them on one after the other.
One after another, yeah. It's. I think that's what it is, right? So there's the new sexy, which everyone wants to go, and there's always something that, this year maybe it's vector tiles, next year or drones, next year who knows what it'll be. Everyone wants to go to that, but it's the PostGIS talks, it's the open layers and leaflet talks, it's the GeoServer and map server talks. Those are the ones that that's where the people that show up to those are the boring people, the people that just do their work using the software to get a product done.
And it's a mix for us. I mean, say we're what I'm working on these days is building enterprise products. We build basically web and mobile mapping for utilities and communications companies, and that's basically built on PostGIS, GeoServer, and Leaflet are the main tools that we're using there. And we've been super impressed, and we're implementing systems in like some of the largest utilities and cable companies, and those products have just held up really well. With thousands of heavy enterprise users and so on. So while they didn't get as much mention in my post and in our discussion today, to me they're certainly really foundational elements. And if you're doing like major enterprise applications, those are the things that are really proven and that are definitely great building blocks. A lot of the things we've been talking about here are the cutting edge things that we'll start using more over the next few years, maybe, say, depending on where vector tiles goes, whether they come in and out.
Yeah. Yeah, some people are like laughing at your vector tiles are not the future comment, but
yeah. Well,
I think you're absolutely right, though. The future. I mean, who knows what the future?
Vectors.
Right?
The vectors are probably the future. I'm just saying, not vector tiles. I think
the vector tiles are the step.
It's an
into the future,
for me, and that I think that people, again, I'm sure various distinguished people have said something about predicting the future. You have to look at the past and say. I mean, it just is very interesting to me how much development in the browser now is paralleling stuff that happened on desktop and workstations, 20 years ago or something. So
yeah, that's interesting.
It's a bit like NASA actually. It's trying to figure out how to go to the moon again. They forgot all of that. All the people who worked on it have retired or died.
And they threw the notes out because no one can understand how to use a slide rule. It's like
exactly
what do we do with this? So you sort of mentioned that you have been looking at some of these projects because. Oh, okay. Well, here before we get into this, Paul Ramsey said you hadn't mentioned Planet Labs.
Oh, yeah. And actually, so yeah, in fact, there's a couple of other things on my list. Thank you, Paul.
Yeah, let's hit those before we talk about you.
Yeah, so, uh, and actually, I can only to a limited extent talk about Planet Labs since that was the one big session I skipped off, and I went into San Francisco to visit a company called OGG who do augmented reality glasses, which was kind of cool. But I'm actually on the board of or advisory board of a company called Aeroglass, which is where Jeff Johnson is working, who
Mm-hmm.
is a bit boundless. And so anyway, that was another cool aside, the whole augmented reality thing. But so I missed that presentation. But basically, most people are probably familiar with Planet Labs are putting all these small satellites up there and really aiming to have relatively low resolution imagery, but that is very current, basically. And so, that's kind of an interesting development. But say, not something that unfortunately I didn't directly see, so I can't comment too much more than that. Have you looked at that stuff much?
Just here and there. Planet Labs is definitely, they're kind of a hot little company. I don't know. There's stuff. I talked to a gentleman the other day here in Phoenix who's in the real estate market, and he was mentioning Planet Labs and some of the stuff they're doing. Maybe that's a market they're going to succeed in. I mean, for what I do, I'm not really sure they add anything. Yeah, who will help me count the cars in Home Depot parking lots? That's. As Brian kind of says it in a kind of snotty sort of way, but he's right. There's so many options to do what they're doing that I almost wonder if there's no business model for them because people will pay bottom dollar.
Yeah.
Sort of what happened to the Digital Globe and hell, I can't even remember who did Digital Globe buy. It was the old space imaging guys. What was that company? Someone help me.
Yeah, well, yeah, it was space imaging, right?
Space imaging, yeah, but who bought space? I can't remember. It doesn't matter. No one can remember.
Yeah.
It's 2 or 3 years ago. But they couldn't compete against each other because all they could do is get these fat government contracts. And once those started getting less and less, there was no market for them to have any. They had to merge. And so, like companies like Planet Labs, it's awesome because everybody's excited using it. But if your business model is just count cars and Home Depots, I mean, of course, we're sort of missing them. A little bit there, but honestly, people are going to pay bottom dollar for that. Someone else said watching wildlife burn up in Arizona, right, and the Western United States, see the change of wildfire. GOI, thank you, Brian, thank you, GOI.
Yeah, so I don't know. I mean, for a lot of the stuff that we do, I'm not sure how useful it is. Again, we're more utilities and communications, but the other sort of vaguely related thing there is drones, which have been, kind of a fairly hot thing at recent conferences, and again there were quite a few presentations on drones, mainly looking at the lower end consumer drones, but there's definitely people doing a lot of interesting sort of small mapping projects with those. I went to a really cool presentation. I recommend watching the video from Raji Burnham, which was build your own drone, and I have been vaguely thinking of buying a drone, but I hadn't really been thinking I'd build one. But after his talk, it looked like kind of fun, and there's open source software and all these interchangeable hardware components, and so there was kind of a cool little test console where he was holding the drone and tilting it, and you see it tilting on the test console, and you can test the communications and everything. But then you can easily kind of customize it to do various things. So like we're doing utility damage assessment applications where you send somebody out and they go and walk around an area and see which poles are down and note down damage. It would be kind of cool if we could just press a button, load the flight plan into the drone and have it fly over and take pictures of all those things and beam it back. And in theory, that should be fairly doable with what's out there today. So that's kind of
so the drones was something that I didn't go to Phos4G. But the drones were, other than Paul Ramsey's talk, which that was the talk of the Twitter sphere. But no, in all seriousness, that was the thing everybody kept talking about: drones. Why? I mean, is it just cool? Is it hip? Is it fun?
It's one of these things. It's sort of cool, But yeah, does it translate into something that will really be heavily used? I mean, I suspect, at the moment there's still. I think it's probably more of a cool factor right now. you know, it is just becoming much more affordable, and you can do a lot of cool things. But you know, you can't really fly over built-up areas. You still have to fly within line of sight at the moment, and so all of those things are kind of restrictions. So yeah, does it really translate into major business anytime soon for like real applications? I'm not sure. I know there was an OpenStreetMap mapping party down in Castle Rock recently where Steve Coast took his drone out, and because he has one now, and he used that to map the park. And I couldn't make it, unfortunately, but he's promised to show me that at some point when we catch up. So you know, for small-scale OpenStreetMap projects or other, you know, small research projects, I think they can be useful. But on a large scale, I think we're still away from that probably.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, don't get me wrong. I want to get myself a nice drone to play with. Fiance would probably yell at me if I were to buy one right now before the wedding. But
Negotiate more on that.
you know, it's interesting. I mean, yeah, as Brian says, drones the coolest business, not technically legal, which is true. I mean, it's something we really want to do. We've used it in some of our projects for LiDAR to get you know, power plants, to have the drones fly around the power plants and get LiDAR, so you can get a 3D model of the power plant.
There is on Kickstarter now. I don't know if you've seen this. Well, I don't know if it's Kickstarter or one of those guys. There's a selfie drone. Have you seen that? That looks like a wristwatch. So.
Are you kidding me?
No. So you strap it on your wrist, and it has these, like, when you unstrap it, it pops out, and so it's like a mini helicopter. It's like a mini quadcopter. You throw it out, it goes a few feet away from you, takes a picture, and flies back. So they have various slightly unlikely-looking things in their commercial, like somebody hanging off a cliff. I'm not sure I'd be trying to catch it again if I was rock climbing, but I did see a live demo it was like at the Intel show or something. But anyway, look out for that one, the selfie drone.
Yeah, that's what the world needs, is easier ways to take selfies. Although I guess if people are actually marketing selfie sticks. So you know what, I laugh at it, but at the same time I have a GoPro, and I've got a Go pole that I hold out on my GoPro, and as I'm doing something, so I guess who am I to?
I did actually succumb and get a selfie stick this week, and actually it does. I did a quick bit of testing with it, and you know, when we travel, there's certain locations where we go where I'm definitely going to be able to get better pictures with it. So.
I saw one on. I don't remember what magazine it was, and it clips on the bottom of your umbrella. And I thought, oh, that's awesome, except in Arizona, when am I going to have an umbrella?
Yeah.
I carry an umbrella to use as a selfie stick, not to actually, you know, keep dry.
Yeah, there you go. Combine umbrella and selfie stick. That would go well in England. Interesting.
So Gretchen Peterson just mentioned something. She goes, selfie drone, great for personal safety, actually. And that's actually a good point. If you could have a drone there that you could throw as you walk through, you know, a campus at night or just anywhere that it could keep an eye on you, that's actually a very good point.
On a bigger scale, you know, this is like a mini selfie drone that you throw out, but then there are several drones, you know, either out or coming out soon that are kind of follow me drones, you know, which are mainly targeted like at mountain bikers and skiers and stuff, but where, you know, you just take footage of you. So
yeah,
I mean, there are a bunch of interesting things happening on that.
Yeah, well, I mean, drones is one of those things that's fun to talk about, and you know, I don't have a drone that I can throw up and play with yet, but I'm guessing I'll be there. Eventually, I'm going to buy myself a drone, and I'm going to spend way too much money on it, and I'm going to break it or lose it, and I'm going to cry. It's like growing up. I remember I had this beautiful. My dad went to Japan, got me this beautiful kite. And I don't know how much he spent on it, but it was a beautiful kite. And so I'm flying this kite, and it falls down in, of course, the one neighbor's backyard that you can't go into, and I lost it. I just imagine that same thing happening to me with my drone, and it falls in some evil man's backyard, and I'll just start crying uncontrollably that I lost my drone.
Well, so actually a story I heard in some of these drone conversations is apparently one thing that you have to do when you get a drone, and it's not always well documented. You know, people are excited and they want to go and fly them, but you have to set your home location, and you know that's like a manual process. And in general, the sort of default behavior on most of these is if they lose a radio signal, they fly home or they fly to whatever is set to home. But on a number of them apparently, home by default is set to 00. So,
There's a bit of barge off the coast of Africa and just.
they lose communication, so they're all flying off to Null Island. So really a whole load of drones at Null.
Oh, goodness. Oh man, that's funny. Well, cool. Well, we got about 10 minutes left. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, you mentioned kites, but there was a kite photography.
Oh yeah, that's still. I made fun of that one time years ago, and there's a lot of kite aficionados out there, and they're very quick to criticize you. So I'm not saying anything about kite photography. I think it's wonderful, and I hope they have a fun time doing it.
So it's a lower tech alternative to the drones.
So you mentioned that you were looking at a lot of these technologies at your company. I mean, can you kind of describe what you're doing and why some of these things are interesting?
Yeah, so for a few years now we've been doing, say, quite high-end enterprise solutions built on an open source stack. And for those who don't know, my background is, with large GIS companies. I was CTO at Small World, which probably many viewers haven't heard of these days, but we became the leader in the global utility and telecom GIS space, and arguably they still are. We got bought by GE. They haven't sold a lot recently. That end of the market has been very kind of stable for the last 10, 15 years. Most of them have bought a big system, invested a lot in it, customized a lot, and it's a huge effort to change. But so we've been trying to sell into that kind of market, well, trying to and successfully selling into that market, sort of web and mobile applications to kind of complement the GIS. So we sort of see the GIS being a pretty specialized thing, but we're trying to come at it from a point of view of making stuff that looks like Google Maps. I mean, it's Leaflet and whatnot, but we like to ask people, have you done the Google Maps training course? And of course, nobody use it. But so many people complain, why isn't my expensive enterprise GIS as easy to use as Google Maps? So that's kind of our pitch, that we're really very much focused on keeping it simple and like focusing on the people who are not really GIS users, the guys working in the field, the managers, the customer service reps, that kind of thing. And that's been going well, so we've got, I think we're up to maybe 15 customers now, and again, these are like really large projects on the whole.
Yeah.
So
large cable companies or large utility companies, kind of.
Two of the top 5 cable companies in the US and a couple of the top 10 utilities. So they tend to be big projects. And yeah, so and basically, say we've been using PostGIS on the back end, been using GeoServer, been using Leaflet. And they've just worked out really well. So, which has been a new thing for a lot of our customers. That most of them haven't used much open source in a lot of cases. But we've found it's a really good alternative to the traditional closed source systems that they've been using.
Yeah. So where do you were kind of talking about these vector tiles earlier as kind of like the future. Maybe describe some of the reasons why you think that, in regards to your company, because obviously, you're using this technology for today, but where you want to be in 5 years is totally different. Well, maybe it's not totally different than where you are today, but the technology will be different. The look and the use of the software will be different. I mean, where do you see this going?
Well, I think the thing that I'm most interested in vector tiles for, or vector data generally, is for offline use. I mean, that's really the specific, most useful thing, where it's like not just a minor change, but something that could really have a big impact. And I kind of mentioned in passing before, but at the moment we use raster tiles a lot because the customers say they want their maps to look the same as they always have done. And there's a whole separate debate there, in that most of them were designed 20 years ago for paper, and they're not the most beautiful maps, but so that's what they want to see. And so at the moment we sync raster tiles offline, so you end up with quite large data volumes, and we have rollouts with 1,000 users or so, and it's just a lot of data that you're shifting around. And we have a solid working solution, but it would really be nice if you could decrease the amount of data that you have to shift around, and vector tiles definitely offer a lot of promise on that. And I think in the immediate term we could use that for OpenStreetMap backdrop data. So I mean, in general, when you're offline, we have a lot of people use Google Maps when they're online, but you can't use Google offline. It's against the terms of service. So we generally use OpenStreetMap when we're offline. And so I think a pretty immediate thing with the various things we've talked about is that we could start downloading vector tiles for OpenStreetMap data, and then with the actual kind of electric network maps or cable network maps, the challenge there is that transitioning to vector tiles, we have to do enough to make the symbology and the annotation and everything look like their existing maps, which is a little bit tricky. So that's the thing that we have to wrestle with a little bit, is will the users accept maps that look kind of different? So anyway, I definitely think that of the various things we looked at, the vector maps is the vector tiles will be useful for offline apps.
Yeah, I mean that's an interesting use case, right? I think you had mentioned at some point, like a lot of these things are, when you're on a great network and you're local and everything's fine, it's like you almost don't even care about streaming tiles down, right? But things like emergency, response, Sandy, Hurricane Sandy, earthquakes, those things that happen. It's like, how do you quickly? And it's almost like we were talking about this. Where was I talking to someone about this? They were talking about, I think it was somewhere in Asia. There was a tsunami or an earthquake or something like that, and they had all this. They had this local police officer. They had some app that would take their maps offline, and they could go out and do whatever they needed with the maps. Except the problem is they weren't able to load. The network went down. They weren't able to load the tiles on their devices to go out. It was like one of these things like you do it, and then you go out in the field. Well, if your office is in the middle of the field because it fell off. It's like you need a solution that is able to do this without having to impact, your mobile device. How big is your iPhone? I mean, do you have 16 gigabytes, or do you have 128? Well, if you have 128, you don't even care about how big these tiles are. But if you have a little itty bitty device, or one of these cheaper Android devices that a lot of these people use, space matters. So it's interesting to think that maybe vector tiles is the way. A true vector. Well, I don't know if it's vector tiles. Vector mapping is the way to get around this issue, because you can compress them, you can store them a little bit easier, and still got flexibility.
All that, and like you say, the disaster response is a big scenario for that. But even on the day-to-day work as well, like a lot of, say, the utilities, the cable companies, they work in rural areas, and so still occasionally they're going to get the signal cutting out. But it's an interesting system design question, because it's just a real. It's just intrinsically complicated to have a robust offline system that works for thousands of users, and you sync large amounts of data every day. And once you have universal wireless coverage, it just becomes trivial, right? That you just do it as a connected application. And we're sort of somewhat close, but at what point can you really bet on that?
Exactly right. So what's the future for that? I mean, the future is just these guys are going to create these vector tiles. But then the infrastructure is going to eventually allow us to actually, I'm trying not to say the word consume, but here I just said it, vectors in these mobile clients. And, I think you're right. I think we're not very far away from that happening. I know people have written apps that do this currently, but there's no real API that does this yet. So, I don't know, I guess we'll see. So when do you think we'll start seeing this kind of stuff? You think 2 years, or you think it's more than that?
What, as in being continuously online, you mean? Or...
Yeah. I mean...
Yeah, who knows? It's really hard to say. I mean, I guess.
Oh, don't come on! We're gonna get you on video. You're gonna say this is gonna happen in 2 years, and when it doesn't, we'll pull the video out and we'll laugh that nobody can.
Europe, it's probably closer than it is in the US, really. I mean, I think by and large, Europe is a lot more densely populated, and it's harder to lose a wireless signal in Europe. There's some pretty remote spots in the US. But actually, I was doing a presentation recently where there's a national broadband map that gives a map of wireless coverage, and I had an old presentation from 2012 where I'd done a screen copy of that map, and I did it today, and it had filled in pretty significantly. So we'll see, but I think these things sometimes take longer than you think, so I'm thinking at least 5 years away from
There you go.
Let's see. So we have that window to still sell our offline solution.
Yeah, within 5 years we'll do this. Otherwise, please buy my little SD card to put in your phone to carry your tiles around with you. Well, we're about an hour here. Is there anything else you want to talk about real quick before we go? Or
Yeah, that's probably the main things. There's a few other little things that again I put various links on my blog. So
yeah, I will make sure I put that in the show notes, and I think they're already in there. But Peter wrote up a quite lengthy blog post about what he thought about the Phosphor G with links, so it's really interesting.
Maybe one last thing I should just mention. So in my original blog post, I mentioned how much Mapbox there was, and how little Boundless there was, and actually the CEO of Boundless, Anne Johnson, got in touch with me and said she'd like to talk to me and update me on what Boundless is doing. So we actually had a good chat yesterday. And in fact, I said to her, I think it's about time I started a rival Hangouts with Peter Batty. So do you want to do a Hangout? But unfortunately, the video didn't work on her end.
Oh.
I did record the conversation, so that's something I'll probably post next week. But
cool.
Talked about what Boundless is doing and whatnot, and so that was kind of an interesting conversation. And
Boundless, I'll look forward to that. I mean, Boundless is one of those companies, I've talked with them a lot. They've gone through a little bit of change in the last year or so, and it's more of a, it's not as big a change as people think it is. But when a lot of people leave a company for whatever reason, they talk. I mean, I talked with Paul Ramsey a couple weeks ago, and he just said, you know what, had nothing to do with anything other than I was ready to go.
Yeah.
And
yes, I think it's overall the company's still doing well. From what she said, they're growing significantly and doing lots of federal business and whatnot. So
yeah.
So anyway, that's something that's on my list for next week.
Well, we'll look forward to it.
Yeah.
Good. Well, so what place are the Colorado Rockies going to finish in the National League West this year?
Oh,
fourth or fifth?
I'm not a baseball guy, James, so I'll have to do.
Oh, come on. You know the answer's 5. Just say the answer's 5.
I'll be aggressive and go for 4th, shall we?
Oh, jeez.
Yeah.
We'll have you back on in September and laugh about it when the Giants are in 5th place.
Yeah. Well, if you make it to Denver, you'll have to. Maybe we can go to a game and you can educate me a bit more.
It's just like cricket, except there's 4 bases instead of 2.
Yeah. More or less it.
It's essentially boils down. Yeah. All right. Well, everybody, thank you so much. Have a great weekend. Peter, as always, thank you so much.
Yeah, well, thank you, James. Thanks for having me on. Good to see you.
And everyone have a great weekend. Actually, we have a special show next week. Well, it's not special. It's just on a special day. Steve Pusty is going to join me at the same time, but on a Monday. So we'll talk about that, and we'll have a good time. We're going to talk about Jakarta being bought, and just some general things in his mind about being a GIS guy, air quotes, working for a non-geospatial company. So it should be fun. Bye, everybody.
Cheers.
Can't click the button. Siri, I'm trying to stop the broadcast, and I can't get my mouse. There we go. Bye, everybody.